Well, Joel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's good to have you here. And Victoria, welcome to the show too.
Hi, thank you.
Victoria is the final member of the Braintrust here at the Reclamation Society that has made it onto the podcast finally. I'm so happy. So thank you for being here.
Pumped to be here. It's so fun.
Yeah, and we're gonna dig deeper here into the hero's journey and whether or not the hero's journey is applicable to both male and female characters. In other words, does the hero's journey and the heroine's journey, do they match or are they different? Particularly as we look at sort of the modern day, and we're even going to talk about whether or not the hero's journey still works in the modern storytelling framework that we find ourselves in. So this will be really fun, and this is, by the way, a concept that Joel pitched me. So thanks for pitching this, Joel. This is great. I had actually 2 pitches for the Hero's Journey podcast, like within 2 weeks of each other. I was like, whoa. People want to talk about this, so hey, there you go. I already mentioned to these guys that I not an expert in the hero's journey at all, so we'll be digging into it. Fortunately, it is fairly prevalent in our storytelling, and so therefore there's a lot of things you can call upon to kind of analyze it. But so I have the first question for you guys here today, and Joel, I'll start with you on this question since you pitched this topic to me. There are 12 steps of the hero's journey. I'm going to read them off really quick just to recap it so people listening and watching can follow along with us. But the first is the ordinary world. The second is the call to adventure. The third is the refusal of the call. The fourth is the meeting the mentor. The fifth is the crossing the threshold. The sixth is tests, allies, and enemies. 7, approach to the inmost cave. 8, the ordeal. 9, reward, parenthetical, seizing the sword. 10, the roadblock. 11, resurrection. 12, return with the elixir. So that's kind of the stages of the hero's journey, if you will. So Joel, tell me, what stories in your mind exemplify this format for the hero's journey?
Oh man, all my favorite ones. And I kind of worked into this backwards. I knew nothing about the hero's journey until fairly recently. And I was so excited to find out that all of the stories that I love really fit this template. So, I mean, you got Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the classic stories of Edmund Spenser and the Fairy Queen, Harry Potter, The Matrix. Matrix is probably one of my favorite movies of all time. And then, ultimately the story, the true story, the fairy tale that is real, the story of creation and the fall and Jesus's redemption of mankind. And so, I probably Star Wars for me. I experienced Star Wars for the first time when I was about 12 or 13 when it was re-released in theaters. I remember that in the late 90s when George Lucas did the special editions. I saw it for the first time and I was completely blown away, and it's stuck with me ever since. So, and it was cool to kind of discover later on how closely Star Wars follows that template. I mean, to a T, really.
Yeah, I know. It's like walks through each one. Which scene should we have now? Well, right. I think we're on Approach to the Inmost Cave. Let's do that scene.
I think the script was really just like Joseph Campbell, and they were like, here you go.
Right. Yeah, Victoria, do you see any others that have appeared here that you...
Like, he was literally like listing all the ones that I had kind of jotted down. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Matrix, all of these. And Star Wars, again, for me, I think... was the thing that got me most interested in story in the beginning. And so it's shaped a lot of my dives into story, whether that's in literature or film or whatever it is, for sure.
Yeah. Star Wars is kind of quintessential for anybody that fits into our age group. We're probably a few different ages here, but anybody that fits into this group that grew up with Star Wars as being like a predominant, form of our story development. I mean, that's just kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And I honestly it didn't come up with anything. It's so funny too, because I was like, I wonder if they're going to say The Matrix. So I put The Matrix down. Like, I want to say The Matrix just in case we don't say it. You both said The Matrix, so I was like, all right, I don't have anything to add.
I mean, you can also add like the Lion King
Oh,
moments,
excellent.
into
Excellent.
that. Yeah, that's one that I had thought
superhero
about,
origin
but
stories too, like the first Spider-Man.
yes.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting too
Yeah.
because some of these that we're talking about occur over the course of trilogies, or some of them even probably longer. Like Harry Potter, probably you could find elements of the hero's journey even into the later films. Whereas, with some of these other films, it's like it all happens in one movie. It's like the entire hero's journey plays out in one movie. So I'll start with you this time, Victoria. How does the hero's journey inform us about how the world works? Like, does it reveal a core truth about the human experience that conveys some sort of deep meaning? Or like, why are we finding so many stories that do it? And why are we finding so much value in these stories?
Yeah, I think that at the core of the hero's journey is, I wrote it down here. I'm just going to reference it because I think I'm more eloquent when I write. It like identifies things that we struggle with, and then it gives us meaning for those struggles. So it gives us a want or a desire, whether that's something that we originally want. There's the refusal of the call. So it's not always something that a hero wants originally, but ultimately it's for our good or for the goodness of everybody. And it helps, the hero has to overcome his or her own flaws in order to achieve their goal or want. And so I think that's something that we're all kind of searching for, is we have a want and we want to know what we have to do in order to overcome, and then we find meaning during that, and it gives us hope during the struggle, and it helps us identify like those moments of I don't know, of overcoming what we have been working through, for sure.
Yeah, there's like moments of significance in our life.
Yes.
There we go. That's a milestone right there. That's a milestone.
I did it. A moment of triumph.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, I agree. I think it speaks to really where we find meaning in our lives, and it follows all of those journeys. And one thing that I was fascinated by when I started to study the hero's journey, of how it's cyclical. This isn't something that happens just once over the course of our lifetime. These are a bunch of little journeys that we take, overcoming obstacles, facing something within ourselves that might be scary or that we don't want to talk about or don't want to deal with, but then coming through that and coming past that, and then once you come out of that, you're at it again. You do it again. It's something that happens all through our lives, and I think especially now, we're kind of, we live in 21st century America. We're so prosperous, and we have pretty much all our material needs met, and we don't want for many things. A lot of us don't, and so I think there's a genuine search for meaning that people have, a search for struggle, a search for something that is transcendent. That I think that these stories really speak to or awaken in us, again and again. And I think that we don't realize, I think a lot of times we don't realize why we resonate so closely with these stories until we really dig into it. But it's kind of the story of all of our lives,
Yeah. And it gives us hope. Most of the stories based on the hero's journey are ones of triumph at the end. And so especially when we go to film, it can be escapist. And so we want to see that moment of triumph. We want to believe that there is a light at the end of whatever tunnel you're currently journeying through. And films, literature, comic books, everything gives us that hope most of the time. Not everything does, but the hero's journey, I think, certainly does.
Yeah. I think you guys are right on. There's a sense that if left to our own like innermost thoughts, we would want to just be taken care of, right? Like we are creatures of comfort. We would like people to just take care of us. And yet there's this retelling of a story which fits the hero's journey, which is, no, actually the thing that's difficult for you is the thing that is good for you to do. And I think that is a story that is worth telling. I think it's interesting, though, that we fight this battle And we're all probably of very similar faiths on this podcast. But we fight this battle, which I think is really interesting, and that is that we tell ourselves these hero's journey stories. But Joel, you started hinting at it earlier, because the story of Jesus Christ is in some ways very similar to a hero's journey. And it's almost like we can tell ourselves these stories till we're blue in the face, but technically speaking, like, we're not going to overcome death. Like, we're not, there's certain things in life that are just tragic that we will not be able to overcome. And so, to your point, Victoria, I think we get into these interesting ways of looking at things where we tell ourselves this is something we should invest in, and that's true. But also, it is a somewhat escapist, because it's not always true. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations that we're just left with a really bad situation, and there's not a hero's journey way out of it, so to speak.
Right.
I think they kind of remind us, there's the hero's journey movies, and then there's movies that are maybe more realistic that tell us straight, tale of reality. And the hero's journey reminds us of not necessarily what is, but what should be, or what could be. And I love the line, and I can't remember the line exactly, in they did the live action remake of Cinderella, where they talk about how this isn't about how things are, this is about how things should be. And I think it's just that they're all kind of little reminders of us that there's something above, this reality that we live in that is messy and doesn't have happy endings all the time, and we fail again and again. But there is an ideal that really, it's like it strikes a chord in our heart when we see it. We know that it's right. Yeah.
In fact, to that point, I did a workshop one time. And the workshop wasn't specifically about fiction and storytelling. It's more about like how to tell an effective story, just in general, just any kind of story. Yeah. But it was very interesting because it talked about basically what you would describe as the hero's journey, but in fewer steps. And the concept of, generally, stories begin with shalom. You might call it the ordinary world. Everything is as it should be according to what the world looks like. And then something devastating happens, and then the rest of the story is how do we recapture shalom in some way, or even improve upon what we thought was originally shalom, but we're getting to a different place. And I think that's ultimately the story of humans, right? Like, of us trying to figure out how to get back to shalom. So it's really cool discussion. So now let's take a look at this, like the hero's journey. Now, does anybody know when the hero's journey was originally kind of entertained by Campbell? You guys know when that was?
Off the top of my head, I don't. Maybe Joel.
Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah.
Did he kind of get his stuff from Carl Jung a little bit?
Probably. Yeah. Wikipedia it. You know what I mean? Like, somebody should Wikipedia it and let us know. But I'm curious as to how impactful the hero's journey has been over time. Because we talked about a lot of different movies that we mentioned Star Wars, because George Lucas has mentioned over and over again that he used this stuff as a baseline for his storytelling. But then even like The Matrix we talked about. And as we start to look at the differences between male and female characters relative to this, I'm wondering if in the last decade there have been any major changes, or can you think of any examples that have been made, changes that have been made to the hero's journey? I don't know, Joel, have you thought of anything that's kind of changed along the way as people have explored this concept?
Yeah, so I've noticed some things that I can't quite maybe make sense of. Maybe you guys can help me. But there are hero's journeys that have a central hero or a heroine, and but generally those journeys work the same way. And a good example of I think a traditional hero's journey that has a heroine at the center is the Hunger Games. You have Katniss Everdeen, you have the mentor in Haymitch, and the whole process that she goes through. But it doesn't stray from that formula of the hero's journey really at all. And as far as I can tell, and it doesn't seem like there's a necessarily strictly feminine or female aspect to that central character. You could almost replace it with a male character and it wouldn't change the story that much. But it seems like there's been a bit of a change recently with some of the movies that have come out. And I'll give a few examples where I've seen this. Captain Marvel was one. Rey as the central character in Star Wars, Elsa in Frozen, and then Harley. I saw Birds of Prey a few weeks ago, Harley Quinn. And it seems like there's this new sort of heroine's journey, or maybe even a specifically feminine hero's journey that is taking place in these movies, where it doesn't seem to be, I guess the way, in layman's terms, the way I've always thought of the traditional hero's journey is you go from zero to hero. You got this guy who's kind of a loser, has got a boring life, and he goes on this heroic journey and comes back better. Whereas these movies, Captain Marvel, Rey in Star Wars, Elsa, is more of a journey of self-discovery, where they started out powerful. They started out, very powerful and capable and incredible. And their journey is more, it's not so much a journey of becoming better or becoming more competent. It's a journey of self-discovery, discovering how powerful you really were. And I just thought it was interesting, and I'm wondering where that comes from, and if there's any precedent for it in older literature, and if it even fits in the template of the hero's journey. It's so curious to me, and I'm as a layman here, just interested in stories. I'm wondering what that's all about.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point to bring up about those stories and kind of comparing and contrasting with Hunger Games. I think it's really interesting. How do I say that? When I look at stories like Captain Marvel, you mentioned Rey and Birds of Prey, and how they are journeys of self-discovery. I don't know that it changes the actual story of like the hero's journey so much as some of the themes that we push with stories about females tend to be more about self-discovery. They tend to be more about like, you already are powerful. This is just how you need to harness it and show it. One thing that I was contemplating as I was thinking about the hero's journey and the heroine's journey is Rey versus Luke, because a lot of people talk about Force Awakens as so similar to the first Star Wars movie.
Right.
They're like, it's the same. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating that they chose to do is Rey is in a place where she's waiting for a family to return to her. And Luke is tied by a family. It is seen more as a burden for him. And for Rey, it's seen as like a gift. Like, I just want this family. And for Luke, it's like, if I didn't have my family, I could go join the rebellion and really do what I want to do. And I think a lot of that is more tied to where we are at as a culture and less about the hero versus the heroine's journey. I think that is just a kind of a process of change, and you can plug in a male or a female, but maybe the themes tend to reflect our culture and where we're at more. And I think self-discovery and finding a woman's power is very honestly on trend. And so we tend to emphasize that. It's very current, and we tend to emphasize that in our stories about women right now more than we do for men. I don't know that we think men as a culture need to go on a journey of self-discovery. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that the question's a really fascinating one, because it gets at sort of like current pop culture and what kind of stories we, like you just talked about, Victoria, but what kind of stories we want to tell each other about how the world works. Because stories are all about helping us understand how to interact with the world, right? Like, how do we interact with the world based on the stories that are being told to us and the stories that we tell to other people? And it seems to me that there are some significant differences. It also seems to me like, I guess the first question you have to ask two questions. One, is there anything that is inherently different between the sexes? Because we're living in a world now where we've identified lots of different gender identities, right? So there's like there's your sex, there's your gender identity, and now it would make sense to me if there were different things that those characters were facing that needed to be told in different ways. So if you take, I think the Luke Rey comparison is really good, because if you take Luke's journey, Luke starts out as basically completely naive and sort of an idiot. I mean, like, one of his first lines is like whining about not being able to go to Tashi Station, right? Like,
yeah. You wanted some power converters, guys.
That's right. You wanted power converters so bad. Whereas with Rey, you don't get the sense at all. The first thing she does is stand up to somebody so that she saves BB-8. It's one of the first. I mean, obviously she's scavenging and stuff like that, but like, we see her be more like assertive, whereas we see Luke, and it's kind of like, Luke's such a nerd, you know, like so we're starting the character journey in a very different place. I would venture a guess that traditionally, if you were to showcase Rey and put just like swap the two characters, it would feel as if, well, two things. One, the fact that our society is largely still patriarchal in nature means that as a female character, we don't need to explore the naivety. The naivety does not come from, the first step is not overcoming naivety. The first step is having confidence in yourself, because perhaps you've been told in society that you're supposed to fit a certain mold. Whereas with Luke's, the mold that Luke is supposed to fill is like, dude, start taking care of yourself. Like, we don't want to see you, like, you know? So I'm wondering if that's a part of it. Is it inherent in our societal narratives? We've kind of said there haven't been a lot of female lead characters. And so if we were to show them as initially being naive, it would almost feel backwards or wrong. And it's better maybe to say you're super capable, but you just don't know it because you don't have confidence yet. But I don't know. I'm putting out there as
we're crafting these narratives to try to kind of move the culture a little bit towards one of more equality, or
maybe. But I think some of it might be just inherent in the experience. So in other words, now granted, I think what you might see as well, because we're hearing a lot of the term incel, involuntary celibate, for young males, and now it makes me question, like, okay, well, does that mean that there need to be more male heroes journey stories, so that those, because the general incel stereotype is that the incel is staying home playing video games and not getting out into the world and not doing things, right? Which would then say that the hero's journey makes kind of a lot of sense for that story to be told in that marketplace. Granted, all video games are kind of the hero's journey, so I feel like they're kind of getting that message. But go ahead.
No, I think that's why folks like Jordan Peterson have had such a mass appeal to millions of young men. I think he speaks very strongly against that kind of that incel culture that's all about rights and not about responsibility. And that's Jordan Peterson's appeal, that kind of call to responsibility. If you want your life to be a certain way, take responsibility for that, and then go on a journey to make that happen. And I think that's the same reason I think millions of young boys flock to the Luke Skywalker story. Is I think there's a thread there that it's the same reason people are flocking to Jordan Peterson right now. There's that longing for wanting to take responsibility for something in a culture that doesn't place a lot of importance on that.
Victoria, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it's fair to say, you were saying that for Rey, it's a journey of owning the power that she already has, and for Luke, he's like naive and needs to learn. Is that a fair summary?
I think that, I'm throwing out the hypothesis, and I would have to test it.
I'm not saying this. Yeah. Right. So taking that hypothesis, I think that both are a kind of naivete, though.
Sure.
Whether or not, if you're unaware that you have power, then you are naive and need to learn to own it, in the same way that I would say Luke does have power in this world, and he's just not making those decisions. And so in relationship to the hero's journey, they both have to make a choice. And so Rey has to choose to leave, and Luke has to choose to leave. And it's very easy to compare those two, since we're all aware how similar those two particular films are.
Sure, but just different themes.
Yeah, I think that for when we tell the story of women, and I'm using these terms very broadly because when you're having a conversation about men and women, you have to be broad, I think.
And we should make that disclaimer, is like, there's so many different experiences that there's no way to say, so we're talking in generalities here. For sure.
Yeah, because I think we have archetypes for what it means to be male and female.
Yep, exactly.
And so I'm just dealing with those, whether or not I agree with those particular archetypes. Right. That's a whole other story. Yeah.
Which is the main criticism of Jordan Peterson, by the way, because he just deals mainly with the archetypes. And then people will just like, he's faced a lot of criticism for just dealing with the archetypes. But
I admit I haven't read any Jordan Peterson, so I don't know.
He's kind of all he's done is he's taken kind of the myth, the Joseph Campbell myth, and he's like, apply this to your own life. That's
right.
Okay.
You're the hero of your own story. Take responsibility, face down the monster, and make your life better. That's kind of his whole thing.
Which I think is a story that needs to be told to everybody. I mean, I think everybody needs to own their own journey, and they need to own the choices that they make and deal with those consequences. And so that's why for me, like, hero versus heroine, I don't think the journey itself is different. I think a lot of the time it's a reflection of our culture and what we're trying to communicate about our culture, what prescriptive ideals we have versus descriptive circumstances. But yeah, so I really think it's more about the themes and the what they have to learn. That's where I think it tends to be different. Specifically, like Captain Marvel, they, as soon as, spoiler alert, I guess, Jude Law's character says, like, you have to learn to control your emotions. I was like, well, now I know he's a bad guy, because there is no way that is the message of this film. That the female needs to learn to control her emotions in order to be powerful. So which I think is it's interesting to go into films kind of acknowledging where we are at culturally. And so what kind of message would, Disney or anybody want to put out there? You mentioned, though, different heroes' journeys, and I wondered if either of you were familiar with Dan Harmon's Story Circle, which is kind of the hero's journey collapsed.
It keeps getting referred to me in YouTube videos, but I'm not familiar with it that much.
Yeah, it's almost like he condensed it.
Yeah, so if you're
a little more generic, right?
Yeah.
Or a little more universal.
Yeah, it's just 8 steps, and it's a lot simpler. If you're a fan of Community or Rick and Morty, it's very easy to see. Nice. But it's character and comfort, and then they want something, followed by they enter an unfamiliar situation because of that want. They adapt to that situation and they get what they want, but they pay a heavy price. So they realize what they wanted will cost them a lot. And then they return back to the familiar, having changed. Sometimes that's with the thing they wanted, or sometimes that's like, I realize it's not actually what I wanted. And so it works especially well for sitcoms, since it typically has them go right back to where they started.
You're right.
Which is ideal for sitcom.
Every episode, it's the same thing every episode? Story?
It's not every single episode, but I think the pilot for Community is a great example of the story circle for sure. Yeah.
So this is interesting. If we were to look at, to your point, Victoria, which I think is a really good one. So Luke and Rey do have different sort of internal things going on that are the impetus for their journeys.
Mm-hmm.
But if you did compare that and go down the list, like the ordinary world, Rey is on Jakku and Luke is on Tatooine, and we know that they need to move. Like both of them are not in good places when they start out. For slightly different reasons, for slightly different internal issues that the characters are facing. But to your point, it's still the same journey. There's the call to adventure for both of them. They both refuse the call. Rey's like, we gotta go back to Jakku. Why does everybody want to go back to Jakku?
Why does everybody want to go back to Jakku?
Exactly. There's now... Yeah, exactly. Now, the one thing that's sort of interesting is the meeting the mentor. I would say that has a slightly different, it seems to me, there's a slightly different connotation when you take Captain Marvel, when you take Rey. What are some of the other ones that I had referenced down here? You take, well, Ripley and Alien, that's a completely different kind of deal. But if you just take those two examples, the mentor that's slightly different. Is that true or no?
You said Rey and what? Captain Marvel?
Yeah, Rey and Captain Marvel, because Captain Marvel, I don't think you would call Samuel L. Jackson's character, Nick Fury, I don't think you'd call him a mentor, right?
Oof. He's the closest thing she has, probably. I admit I haven't seen the movie in a while. I saw it back when it came out. I think originally we're supposed to think of Jude Law's character as more her mentor, and then is replaced by Samuel L. Jackson's character.
And so it almost seems like from the female perspective, and we're taking a very microcosm cut at this because I'm talking about just Rey and Captain Marvel.
Yeah,
they don't have the same sort of, even when Rey gets to Luke, it's kind of like Luke's like, yeah, whatever, you got to figure this out on your own to a certain extent.
Everything you need, he said, I think to Yoda, she already has. There's nothing we have to offer her. Yeah, so there's a little bit of a difference in the mentor category, because like Obi-Wan is super mentoring to Luke. He's just like, yeah, use the Force, I'm going to come back to you as a ghost. He's oftentimes wrong, which is kind of hilarious, but or you could take the same thing as with Neo. You guys both mentioned the Matrix, and Morpheus is very much a mentor to Neo along the way. So I don't know if there's a difference there. Now, again, the reason I bring those things up is that, like, I think that essentially you're right, Victoria, that the journeys are the same. It's just that it feels like there could be different considerations for female characters based on, I don't know what the impetus for it is. I tend to think it's because of the overabundance of good old boys clubs and the overabundance of patriarchy that has been really negative for a lot of women. Because if you look at the stories that are coming out of Hollywood in the last 2 years and the Me Too movement, you're like, whoa, there's a lot of problems here. Like this stuff should not be happening in this context. And that's a different. I think that if I were to guess, I would rather have Rey feel like I need to have confidence to go do this because I can do it. I don't need somebody to tell me how to do it. Whereas with Luke, it does feel like Luke is coming from a standpoint where, like, he needs a lot of guidance. But I'm saying that in a positive way. I think that those messages are actually really good. Not that females don't need mentors. I'm not saying that, but that the fight against the perception of what the good old boys club was is important enough to combat that with a character who needs more confidence. I don't know. Now I hear that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that, like, the message of women having confidence is a reflection on the Me Too movement. Like, we're telling women to be more confident in themselves, and so it's like they can leave situations that I don't know how to describe situations in this moment.
Well,
but
that's fine. That's fine.
Situations, I guess.
And by the way, I'm speaking from somebody who's trying to understand the story, but I think
I don't mean that in a accusing
Yeah,
way,
no,
just
no.
in a, like trying to understand the idea.
Yeah, totally. So I'm wondering if, so I'll just use Captain Marvel because it's a very good example of the mentor character, if it's Jude Law, is full on like Me Too problem, right? Like his whole life goal is to get her not to become the thing that she should be, the thing that she's not only worthy of being, but the thing that we want to see her become. And you can almost like pluck a Harvey Weinstein story out and be like, oh, that's kind of, you want this job, then you got to deal with me. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, like that's it's very ugly and dirty, and I don't like it. But to say
even the not even necessarily that, just to a lesser extent, just your everyday average business world that is you know largely run by men, you know, who are get promoted and move through the ranks through assertiveness and aggression and confidence. There's kind of that implicit
when they're not qualified to, right? When they have qualified candidates that are like, actually, she's way better. So what are we doing here? Yeah. I don't know if that's I don't know if that's the case or not. Are we trying to break down? Are we trying to break down systems that have historically benefited a group of people, a type of people based on demographic makeup? Are we trying to break down our perception of those systems and go, what, this system exists, but it shouldn't? I think that if that's true, I would agree with it being true, and I would want those messages to get out to women of all ages, but especially even young women, and say, so for example, let's say with Luke, right? If you're playing video games in your basement and the thing is you just need to get out of your house and like go do something, then a message for somebody that fits the message that Luke is given, I think is good. If the message is not so much like, hey, you're not playing video games in your basement, you're actually doing really amazing stuff, but the message that you hear told to you is, well, you really won't make it because you're a woman. It's like, that's horrible. Like we should counter that message with something different. And so I'm wondering if these stories are attempting to do that in a subtle way relative to where the characters find themselves. But again, I'm not sure. But it's an interesting thing to think about.
Can we think of is there an example of a hero's journey or a central hero that has had equal appeal to both men and women, or are there heroes that typically men are attracted to, and then some heroes that women are typically attracted to? Does that question make sense?
Well, there's always a question of representation too, right? Because there's always a question of like, do you see yourself in the stories?
Not just representation, but just the nature of the story itself, I guess. The themes that are expressed in the story.
I don't know. That's an interesting question because, like, so let's just take me for example, as a male. I like Rey's character way better than I like Luke's character. In fact, from the moment that we encountered Rey, I'm like, oh, I love Rey's character. Rey's character is, I feel like Rey's character is, and maybe it's this. One of my three favorite characters, just for reference, are in Star Wars, are the Mandalorian. He's my favorite now. Okay. It was going to be Boba Fett, but of course Boba Fett never really did anything, and the Mandalorian does a bunch of cool stuff. So Mandalorian number one, then Han Solo number two, Rey number three. And by the way, Rey probably could have achieved number two if that whole sequel trilogy hadn't gotten kind of some identity issues. But that's a whole different conversation. But so I love Rey's character, and I kind of love these characters, obviously, that are in some ways a little bit of an anti-hero, or not the hero that's not living into the accepted structure or the accepted system, and is rather saying, I'm not doing what everybody else wants me to do. I'm kind of going to do it this way. And all three of those characters do that, and I really like that. I really like that message that the systems that we build inherently, because they're built by humans, are not perfect systems. And so therefore, sometimes we must come in and say, this system isn't right, and I'm going to change the system. So I resonate more with Rey's journey than I do with Luke's journey. I don't know.
As a loser myself, I'd probably identify more with Luke. No, I think everyone's favorite character in the original is Han Solo. I think everyone just thinks Han Solo is so cool, and I love Han Solo. I think Luke's story and his process is something that I identify with, especially the kind of the fear of becoming your father, or the fear of the sins being passed down from the father is something I also resonate with deeply. And so it's so funny because Luke's not necessarily a character you aspire to be, but I think you identify with him in a lot of ways. At least I do. And so that's what has always kind of resonated with me, is that seeing myself in Luke in a lot of ways.
That's really fascinating. Well, first of all, I think you mentioned representation, Jay.
Yeah.
Yes, like there are so many more male examples than there are female examples to pinpoint and look at, for sure. And I had a conversation recently with some friends where all guys and me, and I only say that because we were talking about women versus men and representation and everything. And they're like, yeah, I don't want to, like, that movie's not really interesting to me. I don't really identify with anybody. And I'm like, you don't identify because it's a female? Like, do you understand like how many movies I watch that I have to identify with the male protagonist? Like, it's not about whether or not it's a male or female. It's about like the journey that they go on and like the qualities that they exhibit. And I think for a long time, like, and I wonder if for you all, if you feel like that has affected you at all, like you've seen so much male representation that it makes it a little bit harder to view story more about like what the character goes through versus that being a male or a female. But that's a sidetrack. I would say Princess Leia actually is the person that I would identify the most with. Is like, she has a goal, she goes after the goal, she does get captured, but even her rescue, yes, she needed somebody to like open that one door, but once she's out that door, she is very actively a part of that rescue mission. And she's sarcastic about the rescue mission from the get-go. So I love that.
Well, sure. I think some of the problem that I'm trying to describe or articulate comes out of the representation issue, because I think that like it's almost kind of like white males expect to see themselves on screen. Whereas I don't think that people of color, females, they don't have that expectation the way that. So for example, if you apply that to Luke and to Rey, it's kind of like we're telling all of the Reys out there, you should expect to see yourself. Why are you doubting yourself? You should expect and demand that you should be on screen. Whereas we're telling the Lukes, like, don't be an idiot. Of course you're going to be on screen. Just figure it out, right? Like, and again, I could be wrong, and I could be not seeing it that way. But I do think that it's been historically two points here. One, I do think that women have gotten the short end of the stick on lead characters. There's no question about that. There's not even a question of whether or not that's true. Like, it is true. Go count the number of lead female characters there are, especially in science fiction, fantasy, and comic book stuff. There's far fewer. Right?
Yes.
So there's the statistics are there. And so I feel like like you're saying, Victoria, like you've had to try and see yourself in the male characters, let's say.
Yeah.
Go for it.
And maybe not even try. It's just like, I've always watched these films, so it's never been a question. It's never like, oh, I have to find something to identify with. It's like, I mean, when I first saw Star Wars, I was like, yeah, Luke, like, I get that. I'm like you know?
Right.
So for me, I don't feel like it was as much of a learning curve, because it's just like, that's where I was thrown in.
Totally.
But I wondered if it's different for you gentlemen.
Well,
I think the example of the Hunger Games is really good because I that wasn't jarring to me at all. I watched it and it didn't even occur to me honestly that you don't even think about the fact that she's a female character necessarily. I mean, it's a very straightforward hero's journey, very similar to Star Wars in a lot of the beats, I think. And I don't think I started noticing it until it seems like they started to take heroines and make the journey more of a female, a specifically female journey, as opposed to a generic hero's journey with a female lead. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Tell me more about that. Like, what do you think made it more of a female journey than just a hero's journey?
Yeah.
If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I think just kind of what I alluded to with the difference in being one of self-discovery rather than learning to grow into something new or something different. That's what struck me, at least, as something that was uniquely feminine to me.
Interesting.
And I don't know, but at the same time, it all mixes into it because there is an element to Luke's story too, where he doesn't realize that he's a Skywalker and he's discovering his power as well.
And he has the Force. Yeah,
he has the Force, and he doesn't know it. So his journey is one of self-discovery too. So I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it does seem like I think that there is a lot of cultural forces in play where there is a sense to where there are some characters that are written to very specifically make a statement about where we're at as a culture, and be a rebuke to a lot of the patriarchal things that we see today that women have to deal with every day. And so I think there's an element, I don't know, just at least more recently, maybe in the last 5 years ago, it seems like there's more of that element present in some of these heroine stories. At least. So
let me ask this question, because this is there's a couple of things that I want to explore here as it relates to, and this is maybe not so much hero's journey as just when we talk about lead characters in general and the way that lead characters are handled. But there's a bunch of criticism for people trying to compare Captain Marvel to Wonder Woman. Yeah. But I'm just going to go on record as saying, I mean, I compare Superman to Batman all the time. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't compare Captain Marvel to Superman. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't compare her to Batman. I'm just, for the sake of saying female characters, I'm going to compare the two. Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman. Did you resonate with one of those movies over the other movie, and do you know why?
Personally, as an audience member, I enjoyed Wonder Woman more. So that's a hard question for me to answer, just because I prefer one movie over the other.
Right.
As for like identifying, I appreciated that Wonder Woman felt like a hero's journey told with a woman, whereas Captain Marvel for me felt very much like it had a message of women being strong, and I absolutely agree that women are strong, and that I believe that emotions for men or women, like, that is a powerful tool that we are all given, and that we should use that tool. But it felt very messagey to me, so it was a little bit harder for me to encounter the story and the characters, and just, I mean, it's the story of a woman who isn't in contact with her emotions, or like is trying to tamp them down. And for me as a moviegoer, I want to see a lead character who is passionate and driven and going after a goal and doing everything within their power to get that goal. And when you are given a protagonist who is not emotional and you don't see that, just from a story perspective, it's harder for me to connect with that character.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about you, Joel? Did you find one movie or the other movie?
I enjoyed, similar to you, Victoria, I enjoyed Wonder Woman a lot more, just as a movie. I thought it was a more well-made film. There's I'm going to skip tracks a little bit, but there's a movie that just came to mind that I feel like does this really, really well. And it's the movie Tangled. Tangled is classic hero's journey. And she is dead set on this goal of seeing the lights. And what is interesting, though, is her as the central heroine, the catalyst that sets the story in motion, who also kind of turns out to be her mentor, Flynn Rider, is also kind of her love interest. So there's this element where, there's this mentor presence there, but she falls in love with the mentor, which that's another thing. That's another element to hero stories. It's there's you don't often see a heroine as a central role in a story that doesn't fall in love in some way or another. That's almost like it's like comes with the territory, it seems, with these stories.
The trope of the genre to a certain degree.
And the one exception being Moana, another classic hero's journey where she doesn't fall in love, and that was very celebrated specifically for that reason. That here you have this central heroine who it's not all just about the love interest. And so I think it's interesting. Do you think that our stories are moving in this different direction, or do you just think it's this cultural moment that we just happen to be in now, where we're maybe pushing back against some of these tropes, or what do you think about that?
I don't know. So a couple thoughts really quick, because we just talked about Frozen on the podcast, and I wasn't on the main podcast, but I just did a separate video on it because I had the questions. And I thought, well, I'll answer these questions. But one of the things about Frozen that I thought was really fascinating relative to the journeys the characters take was that at the end of the day, Frozen doesn't get enough credit for this probably, but Frozen is all about community. And you'll notice that all of the villains are trying to draw people out of community and out of intimacy, whether it's an internal sort of like Elsa's internal problem of trying to relate but can't relate because she's supposed to keep all of her power at bay, versus Anna, who is attracted to somebody that she shouldn't be attracted to because he's just trying to pull one over on her the entire time. And all of that is to draw them back into community. And the love that is the story there is more about the love of and friendship of the community than it is any sort of romantic love, which I think is done really, really well. So I like it when tropes are completely broken. I like it when we don't get a message that is. So this will lead me to my second point. I also liked Wonder Woman a lot better, but that was not true of a lot of people on Twitter. The reason I compare the two is because they're both female characters. They're both based on comic book characters. They're both really strong female characters. I liked both movies. I think Wonder Woman kind of did it better, did the whole story better. I think that she was easier to relate to as a character, and it was easier to see why she was. She also had a very altruistic reason for. Wonder Woman has the best message in a comic book movie that you will ever find. Like, we're doing this because we should love other people. Like, that's amazing, right? And so I think that, I think stories will always be things that the individuals are dealing with relative to the society, and an externalization of the feelings, the emotions, what we go through when we're dealing with the world around us, and a message to try and figure out how should we act, what perils exist for us to look out for, things that we'll need to overcome in life. I think all of those things are always embedded in the stories that we tell. And so I just think that we get little bits of different nuances. I think that some films, this is one of the things that I like to talk about a lot. Is one of my biggest passions about storytelling is that one of the biggest things with stories is that oftentimes, instead of trying to explore the topic in depth, we actually just create a propaganda piece. And if we don't see multiple angles, we don't see how the other person's dealing with it, how different types of people would deal with the same situation, how different characters in the same story deal with the situation, then it can become sort of more of a propaganda film and it just lacks nuance, right? So I do think that that's the one cautionary thing, is to how do we make sure all of our stories have a lot of nuance? And that's kind of a trickier thing to do, especially these days with the budgets of things and just needing to get a movie out.
Maybe kind of what I'm getting from all this is that this isn't necessarily about a man's story versus a female story, or, masculine versus feminine. This is about true to life stories.
Yes.
Regardless of what the reality is, it's got to reflect the truth. It's got to tell the truth about life.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think too, like the more nuanced your storytelling is, the better that message will resonate. You know what I mean? Like, which I think it'll resonate with more people because they see, even if they aren't represented on screen, they can see themselves on screen. I feel represented on screen by Gal Gadot in Wonder Woman. I feel represented by her on screen because I think that she has, despite my favorite character being Batman's reason for doing what he does and creating order and fighting corruption is not as altruistic as Wonder Woman's. And so as a person of faith, I actually think Wonder Woman's more on the right track with this than Batman is, And so I love that. I love that kind of thing. So I hope we see more and more of it.
Wonder Woman is somebody to aspire to. Batman might be a little bit more close for me, at least, to who I would be as a person.
Very true. Very, very true.
Like, I'm not going to pretend I'm like perfectly altruistic or anything like that.
So I think that's a good way with your quote, Joel, about trying to find where the truth is in this. Let's just go ahead and end the podcast there, because I think that's absolutely true. Whether or not the heroine's journey is any sort of different, we'll just pose that question to our audience and see what they think. But Victoria, where can people find you and the stuff you're working on?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook. I would go to Instagram at Toribellious, Toribellious.
Nice.
And I also produce with Screen 14 Pictures. You can find us on YouTube and Instagram.
Awesome. And by the way, this is a cool story, and that I'll tell. We are so Victoria's part of our storytelling Braintrust here at the Reclamation Society. Yes, it's so cool to have you on board, by the way.
I love doing it.
It was such a cool first meeting, but so one of the things that Victoria said was she goes, because I was, as a producer and as a writer, I had a story. All the characters in this story are fairly they're grimy characters, right? And so I wanted to be careful about representing them in a negative way. And one of the things that one of the pieces of feedback that Victoria gave us was, I think your lead character should be female. And it is now a female character.
Oh, yay!
Yeah, which is awesome. So I appreciate that. Victoria.
I'm glad to hear that. Though I will put out there, that's not going to be my advice for every story ever. Totally. I'm not just where's your female representation?
Yeah. Well, no, I always appreciate the challenge, because I'm always trying to think through that and how that could work, and it can. I think it can be challenging. So this is last soapbox thing I'll say. I think it can be challenging to ask people who are. It's not impossible. It's challenging to ask male writers to write female characters. The better thing to do is to ask a female writer to write a female character. So not only do we need more representation on screen, and I know I'm not saying this is not, I'm not a hero for saying this. Lots of people have said this already, but we need more representation in our writing rooms and in our places where we're telling the stories. So
I think it on top of that, us men just don't understand women whatsoever.
Here's the thing, though.
I'm just kidding.
I do think that's
the longer I'm married to my beautiful wife, the more I realize I don't know
Yeah. One of the things I think is so fascinating when we talk about female characters is that I have had a lot of influence from a lot of different kinds of women. And this is the issue with stereotypical characters as well, right? Like, I will tell you that, like, if you looked at what they did in life and you looked at my mom and my dad, you would say, oh, the gender roles are standard. But if you looked at how they actually dealt with the world and how they actually thought about the world and how and the emotions that they portrayed to people and how those worked, they were flip-flopped what you would assume the gender roles to be. So I didn't grow up with an expectation of like, well, women must be this way, because my mom wasn't that way. Like, that wasn't a thing. Although my granny way more fit the traditional gender roles, right? So we can't be too stereotypical. I know you weren't saying that, Joel, so this is not a criticism of what you're saying. But I'm just reflecting as a writer of, like, you can think about the influences you have in your life and write those characters, because that's how that, oh yeah, that's right. The stereotype would be for them to do this, but that person wouldn't do this, you know?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that it's incredibly important to have more females represented in the writer's room, in the producer's room, on every aspect of any kind of production, and also on screen as well. But that means having those female characters. And one of the things that when I talk to, typically I hear this from men, that it's hard to write women. And the thing that I would say to that is, don't think about it as like you're writing a woman or a man, because when you sit down and write a man, you're not like, I'm gonna write a man. You just, all right, this is a dude, so this is what this means. And because then what are you gonna turn out? What are you gonna get, The Rock? Like, Dwayne Johnson? Not every man is Dwayne Johnson, we have these ideas of what it means to be masculine and feminine. Instead, when you're sitting down to write a character, whether it's male or female, start thinking about, like, what character traits does this person have? What formed those character traits in this person? And then as the story goes, I do believe a lot of the time a character could be male or female. I don't necessarily think that, like, men have kind of like a corner on certain character traits and women have the corner on certain, and I'm not saying that you do believe that either way, but like, yeah, like, think about it more like, okay, these are the character traits, this is how they're going to serve the story and all of that, and then kind of go from there and not worry so much about the gender or sex of the individual.
Victoria, because I mean, when you really think about it, we all have elements of what you might consider traditional masculine and feminine.
Absolutely.
I have feminine aspects to my personality, quote unquote feminine aspects to my personality, and masculine. We're all a mixture. And when you start, kind of brush away the gender of the person, and you start with their character qualities, that really frees you up to just write them however they should be, right?
Yeah.
Good insight.
One of the things I've noticed, because I agree, I totally agree with that. One of the things I've noticed is that what tends to happen with people's perception is that people are looking for information in order to understand why something is occurring in a story. And I tend to think that stories are basically an exploration of an issue, and then all of the whys that you have to answer that led to that being the case, right? And when you don't have a compelling why, then it's a coincidence, and all of a sudden it's like the coincidence feels totally wrong. But one of the things that I have thought about is that a lot of times it's not whether or not the character is male, female, African American, white, whatever, but rather it is the writer or the storyteller not providing a why for what the character is doing, and the audience bringing their preconceived biases to that character and going, that character would never do that, because they've brought something to it. Right. So, but if you provide a why for that, why that character would do that, the audience will go along with it almost every single time. They'll go like, "Oh, okay."
Yes.
So I think that that's one way to counter that, like, "Oh, the character doesn't feel right," or whatever.
Yeah, that's great advice and just a great perspective on storytelling. It is our responsibility as the writer to provide those whys. And it's
Yeah.
like a joy and also incredibly difficult.
Totally.
You're like, but I need this to happen, but
Exactly right. Well, Joel, thank you for, first of all, presenting this as a topic for us. Fascinating discussion, really good
yeah.
discussion. Tell us a little bit about where we can find you.
So I have a little. So I write for the Babylon Bee. I also have my own little satire site called The Petty Prophet. So The Petty Prophet is where you'll find all the stuff that doesn't make it on the Babylon. So the less funny stuff from the. I'm selling this. But my website is thepettyprophet.com. So it's PROPHET.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Joel W. Berry. It's BERRY. And on the Petty Prophet, you'll find some satire. You'll find some serious op-ed stuff, and then in the future, that's where I'm going to start releasing some chapters of my book when I start into that.
Nice.
So,
Fantastic.
That's awesome.
We'll see where that goes, but yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for joining me, and thanks for a fascinating discussion. I loved every minute of it, and I appreciate you both. So thank you.
Thank you, Jay.